Architecture is a reflection of who we are. It's an expression of culture. It shapes how we live, how we relate to each other, and how we feel. But there are those who say today's architecture has lost its cultural and spiritual grounding, that cities have sacrificed beauty for modernist utility. Others argue that modern architecture is just as civic-minded and awe-inspiring as traditional styles. Our question today: have we lost touch with beauty in the world we've built? In this episode of Doha Debates, we're joined by experts, global thinkers, each with their own take on this issue.
I think we lost the touch of beauty, we lost the touch of ourselves, and how architecture plays an important role in enhancing our life experience.
The architectural idiom that we have adopted has embodied a cultural decline and a moral decline, intellectual decline that created this emptiness that we see today.
For me, beauty is not a universal single standard, and therefore the way we define it varies from context to context and cultures.
Modernist architecture is more steered towards ideology rather than seeking beauty.
Their perspectives will be explored and questioned in a Majlis-style debate grounded in understanding and a search for truth. Watching over all of this will be a group of university students and recent graduates. After our guests finish their debate, the students will reflect and deliberate before returning with their own insights, ready to challenge, agree, or offer entirely new perspectives. I'm Darine Abougaida, and this is Doha Debates. Welcome to you all. Thanks so much for joining us. Marwa, what do our buildings say about our civilization?
Well, I think today our buildings refer that we no longer have civilization in the traditional sense of civilization, because civilization actually depend on the distinguishment between one nation to the other. So it's an in-group definition, and it also revolves around elevating values. So it's not only about advancements and technologies, whereas today it's all about utility, and in that sense it's only the passive limitation of the human condition. So in my view, we live in an era that is very unique for having no civilization in traditional sense.
Carl, do you agree? No civilization in the traditional sense?
Yes, I agree to many of the points that Marwa raises, and the critique of focusing on utility instead of more traditional building techniques, if I understood you correctly. Part of my critique is also that instead of seeking traditional values and beauty in architecture, it has been replaced with ideology. And I think that is has a negative consequence for the built environment and for the humans living in it.
I'm going to come back to you and ask you to elaborate on that a little bit, but first let me ask Tariq for your point of view on this. What do you think our buildings say about our civilization?
I think I kind of agree with the previous comments. I think we lost touch. We lost kind of, the rooted and grounded connection between buildings and our civilizations. Because I think maybe the kind of lifestyle we live, the modern kind of era we live in, the speed we live in terms of our day-to-day experience and life, gradually we lost the connection between how our buildings are reflecting our civilization. Civilization is basically our identity, our spirit, our roots, our culture. And unfortunately, I'm not referring only to our region, but globally, the buildings, they're becoming to be a bit more identityless. So they're lacking identity.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And I think this is part of our architects' main mission, is to bring back the sense of how the buildings could reflect really who we are and how can be part of representing our identity, our lifestyle, and effectively our civilization.
Bidisha, are our buildings losing our identity?
I wouldn't say it's losing our identity. Where I do agree is architecture has always been about expressing values and culture. I would challenge that we are changing. as a society, how we interact, the world is much smaller. It's much less black and white. And what is happening within the built environment is sort of a reflection of that change. Before the change was happening in centuries. Now you're seeing change happening within decades. And technology is changing, it's not even decades, it's years. So the speed of change, which Tariq refers to, the speed of life, it's changing a lot. So we need to keep up in our built environment, reflect that modernity or that part of modernity which is happening.
She's saying we need to keep up with the pace of modernity and make
So-
our buildings reflect
She's
that.
like, values are changing, so like,
Yeah.
do we not care about beauty anymore?
But she just mentioned that values and humans like just 10 seconds ago.
So she's not pro-tradition.
No, she's
of
not. She's
architecture.
not. She's not.
This is an era that is very different from the era before in terms of systems, in terms of spiritual beliefs, in terms of processes. So all of this indicate that we live in a time that is completely disconnected from times before. So it's all about creating change, like Bedisha was mentioning. It's the opposite of settlement, and settlement, which requires time and permanence, is actually goes against the modern creations, because they are always on the move, always creating change.
So are you saying that we're losing the spiritual core? And Tariq, are you nodding along with what Marwa has to say? Or do you have a point of
just to go back a bit, I think
Yeah.
it's fundamentally wrong to believe that any modern thing is correct thing.
100%.
We always think that modernity
is very
is
true.
necessarily a good thing to do.
Absolutely.
So it's good in certain aspects of our life. But I think in architecture, again, we need to define what do you mean by modern? Is it the material we're using? Is it the construction technique? It reflects how we live now. And sometimes it should actually bridge some gaps and problems we're living in our society at least. I mean, I always say that we spend 8-9 hours at work and then maybe 8-9 hours at home. So we spend good time of our daily life in indoor spaces, in buildings. And how we design these buildings, how architects are designing these buildings to enhance our day-to-day lifestyle is very important. What is, for me, if the building is rooted, it reflects our identity, it reflects the environment, the nature, our lifestyle. It helps our day-to-day life. That's modern, that's present architecture.
Okay.
So,
Carl, are we losing that spiritual core that we're talking about here? And also, when we build taller, when we build faster, when we build louder, so is something more eternal slipping away?
Definitely. We are losing harmony when it comes to how it harmonizes with the environment, the built environment and the nature.
Very true.
We're losing beauty, that it's not supposed to be beautiful, but it's supposed to be more provocative. We're losing craftsmanship, built tradition, because it's more of an artistry. The architect is more of an original thinking artist instead of a craftsman. Today's modernist architecture has become a servant for different ideologies instead of being built for the people that are supposed to use it.
I mean, obviously, Carl's mentioning there's a lot of things which have been lost, but if we step back a bit, modernism, modernist architecture, this happened, it's the past. After that, we have had a whole range of isms which have happened. So that's one of the things where I think we are tending to oversimplify. We might be critical of what came up in the so-called modernists or modernism or, Bauhaus or all of these movements, but they rose from a certain need at that point in time.
That is true, though. That is what she is saying. That is
And
true.
I also disagree that there's not craftsmanship. The way the craftsmanship is executed is different. And now we have robots, or we have more, it's less manual perhaps, but then there's also a big shift towards starting to look at traditional crafts and kind of digital design. So it's not all doom and gloom. For me, it's something which is evolving, and we are finding new ways of expressing ourselves.
Okay, Carl, I know you wanted to comment.
Yeah, just
before
a
I
brief,
get the take of Marwa and Tariq. Yeah.
Yes, just a brief comment that I personally do not believe in the zeitgeist, in the sense that something cannot be built today in a certain style because it has been built like that before. I don't think that
is very true.
architecture has to reflect one's time, because what is that? I can see the technology part of it, but not that we as humans have changed so much that style has to change.
Yes. Yes.
Like
Oh
we're
my
being
God.
forced
Yes.
to change.
I did my bachelor's in fine arts in interior design. A lot of the course was woven a lot in architecture. And I think had I been in this field or not been in this field, I would always have very strong opinions about it, because I do think spaces are central to our emotions, our experiences, and the way we evolve naturally.
The tide is changing now, so we see other trends growing from the problem that was created by modernism. And it's also important to remember that skill does not define art. Art happens in another field, in the field of high moralism, high values, the elevation of the spirit, also in the field of social agreement and creating consensus and relationships. So that's very important to distinguish. The third thing is to remember is that the paradigm shift that happened, that we have now a change of patronage. So the relationship between architecture and power and the architect and client has drastically changed. You have the dismantling of the princely courts, where the artist and the intellectual elite gathered around the patron. Now the relationship is individual. It's one man to another interaction, whereas it was a circle of people that allowed for more social agreement and for more refinement as well. That's from one end. On the other end, we are witnessing a cultural decline because we are witnessing a distance from language and from writing and from all those systems and processes that used to be a filter for ideas. That's how you had a judgment of taste in society. Whereas now it became all subjective because we no longer have this standard of taste to judge against.
That's not true.
Well, I
don't agree with that.
don't agree with.
There's always so many things that you have to consider that you shouldn't be thinking just from a you perspective. You should be thinking from a everyone perspective.
Everyone has their own tastes. If there's something you don't like, you will find someone who does like it. And if there's something you like, you will find someone who doesn't like it.
We always forget that our profession is very subjective, meaning the beauty to judge a beautiful building from a non-beautiful building is very subjective. Beauty is subjective. So architecture and design.
Against this, okay?
Sorry?
I'll wait till you finish this point, but I mean, some people argue against this subjectivity.
Absolutely.
No, beauty is subjective.
Absolutely not. You know, you can argue like wishy-washy that, everything is subjective. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Yeah, okay, like I get it. It could be good for you, but objectively there are standards of beauty.
I'm just saying that from an external appearance, architecture, whether it's modern, traditional, etc., whether it's reflecting certain era, it's subjective. But the most important thing we forget is what this building is adding a value to the way we interact with our surroundings and with our kind of buildings. I think we have one of the most serious, important professions in history because we are a space and the place makers. We are drawing the cities and we are also affecting the day-to-day life of people. And if you look at it now, I think we lost the touch and we lost the feel of our kind of mission as an architects and how it plays a huge part in society. Up to date, the only buildings that actually stands out are the buildings that's been built centuries ago. Mm-hmm. When I first went to Granada, Alhambra, and I've been to inside the palace, and I spent almost half a day walking around. Maybe that was maybe the only time I asked myself if I can call myself as an architect. Because how buildings actually they should be done, how buildings are actually embracing our experience with the surrounding, embracing our experience with the society, our data, kind of the day interaction with the building itself. Alhambra took them tens and tens of years to build. We are living now in a very fast time. Things has to be done quickly. And architects, unfortunately, they need to deliver, they need to fulfill clients. Previously, most of the buildings been led by governments, by authorities. Now buildings are mainly developed by developers, private developers. So there are lots of values, there are lots of factors that added to the scene of architecture that makes architecture kind of our mission diluted a little bit.
On this issue of beauty, is beauty in architecture, you think, a universal language that transcends time, or is it a reflection of each generation's evolving values?
I think that there are objective criteria to beauty.
Mm,
And
absolutely.
to say otherwise would be to have a very relativistic and subjective point of view on it, because then it's like, well, beauty can be anything. And I don't mean by saying that there are objective criteria, that there is like, this is beauty, black and white, that's it. But
It's in the eye of the beholder.
No, I wouldn't say so. I would say that there is a range that you can define and strive towards finding some definitions.
That is so true about how it's not about beauty in the eye of the beholder. Architecture is so much more. It's not just about if you find it subjectively beautiful or not. It's about, does it serve its purpose? Is it holistic in the way that it's built? You know, like, does it help the community, or can it be used by the locals?
There is some objective criteria, like for instance, just some basics that there should be a harmony. Then you can define, well, what is harmony? Well, that there should be some kind of a symmetry, some kind of a ratio between what is being built, some kind of connection to nature, some ornamentation. What ornamentation is most beautiful? Is it the Hindu ornamentation, or the Islamic ornamentation, or the Viking ornamentation?
So it's subjective.
Well, that is more maybe subjective, but you can make some arguments and find some similarities that, well, maybe all of them that are being called beautiful do have some connections to patterns found in nature. Well, then you're one step closer to finding an objective truth.
This is my guy. This and the
Our guy. Our guy.
Yeah, you know what? I thought I was going to disagree with him. But
Yeah, honestly, no, same. I thought I was going to disagree.
I do think that there are objective values to beauty that expand across times and cultures and everything, but then some aspects of it are subjective. Just to expand on that and relate it to what was said about art, I think that has mixed into the conception of beauty, making like everything that is beauty is the eye of the beholder, and I do not agree with that.
Okay, you don't agree with me. Okay, fine.
Just one point.
Yeah, go ahead.
I completely disagree with connecting art and architecture.
No, that's not true.
What?
That is not true.
now?
Because art could be representing your emotions, your feelings. It's really a representation of how you feel in that specific moment. We cannot do that because we have people using our buildings.
No, like if there's anything on the planet that is art, it is architecture. Like, are you serious?
He mentioned something that just infuriated me when he said that art and architecture is separate. His point of view was art evokes emotion. And if buildings don't do that, what are they supposed to? Are they just merely for you to go in, you do the intended job as an occupant and you leave? I feel that was very, it empties the soul of what architecture truly stands for.
We have people look at our buildings,
Well, it's called practical art.
Sorry?
Architecture is called practical art. So there are practical arts.
I mean, it's beautiful, definitely. For me, I'm just always stressing on the importance that we have towards our societies, how we live in our buildings.
Well, beauty is a social value.
I agree, but having a bad painting won't have an impact on you.
But having a bad building will have an impact
100%.
on it. The objectivity of beauty here relies on its ability to change minds. So if I could convince you how these forms are relating to each other, how this arch is taking your eye to a place where there is a meeting point between the ceiling and the wall, you would be persuaded to think it's beautiful. So it demands your attention at the beginning, and it also can be changed through reason and logic.
Okay. Badisha, look, I mean, in many of the world's great traditions, Tariq a moment ago was mentioning Spain, Alhambra. I mean, architecture was carefully composed, right? Following laws, there were laws of harmony, laws of proportion, laws of resonance as well. As we've heard how the rest of my guests here define beauty, how do you see it? And do you think it's something we can recognize across cultures, or is it something that we're taught to see over time?
I don't think there's a universal one in terms of the definition of beauty. What I would agree, and which has been touched upon by various points, is there are probably some connecting threads which do allow your beauty and my beauty. If we talk to each other, we can both appreciate each other's point of view. But it doesn't necessarily mean that when I come and see something, that it is immediately beautiful for me because it is beautiful for you.
Where should the line be drawn between being intentional and having beauty? Like, you know, like now the line is blurred. Because if to you, beauty isn't intention, then what is it? Because to me, it is.
We seem to be talking about beauty in architecture, but architecture is first a tertiary functional requirement. And it's a bit like food and clothing. And, you know, once you've taken care of the basic, we then start to elevate it and try and find different layers and meaning, and, you know, you create that sense of art. But at a very first basic level, we need to be responding to what is the requirement of today. Personally, for me, I don't like too much ornamentation. I do find a lot of beauty in having technology kind of reflected in the way you have built something. And this also holds true not just for today. If you look at vernacular architecture, which a lot of people are talking about, look at the way it was
Can you
built.
explain that for anyone who might not know?
So vernacular, i.e. something which was rising from the geography, the climate, the available technologies. So I think I might have expanded the topic a bit, but what I'm trying to say is the definition of beauty within architecture, it is a layer which comes after. And also I think for me, art does not exist if you don't have someone who can appreciate it. Like it, hate it, if it doesn't have a reaction, it doesn't exist. And it's the same with architecture. If I don't have people who can experience the space, understand the narrative of the journey, then somehow it's meaningless. For me, it's not about the visual aesthetic so much as actually the experience of the building. We can't continue to build the same thing because the requirement of the cities are changing, the requirement of infrastructure is changing. So there will be a change.
But that's utilitarian conception.
Yeah. But architecture is utilitarian. That's what I'm saying, at the first basis.
No,
it's not.
No. That's the only thing I disagree with.
Oh my God.
When I heard Ms. Sinha talk about just utility, I think that just made me feel very, I wouldn't say empty, but it made me feel almost disconnected that these are the people that are actually building these spaces and have not no understanding, but have a very different understanding to what architecture truly means.
I think when we reduce our living to utility, we are reducing ourselves to non-human beings, basically. Because the difference between human and non-human is that we live in the excess, we live in the above utility. The role of art is to emphasize the human condition. And you see it in all the great works of art, including architecture. You pinpoint the guilt of modern creations by emphasizing that it's all about utility.
No, that's not what
And I think, sorry, just one comment about the difference between vernacular architecture and architecture in terms of practical art. The vernacular is an organic response. So in my view, it cannot be defined as architecture because it's a natural response to the availability of materials that you mentioned.
I don't quite see that difference because architecture, vernacular architecture, or if you want to say something which is grounded in local tradition or skills or materials, for me the difference is vernacular was incremental. And now, because of the time we live in, it is extremely high speed. Alhambra is beautiful because, you know, Tariq is right. It was built over, decades. The Taj Mahal is considered beautiful because it was built over decades. But if you look at the backstory of that, maybe not so nice in terms of what happened socially at that point in time. So I don't think we can conflate the two like that. If we start getting critical, we can find the for and against for each of these. But for me, vernacular architecture still is something which responded to the time. I am not claiming that today's architecture is vernacular because technology travels.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree because I think architecture, because it responds to the speed we live in, it became kind of tasteless because it has to catch up, it has to follow. Unfortunately, it became kind of a trend. the architecture. I think even in the region here in the 90s and early 2000s, there was a clear perception that we need to do curtain wall skyscrapers because that's modern architecture. We are now modern, we are advanced. And for me, I cannot have a building in Stockholm, the same design exactly, and just put it in Dubai or in Bahrain or in Doha or in Buenos Aires. It has to be contextual. I love modern architecture, don't get me wrong, but why the buildings in the past were so beautiful? Yes, one, it took forever to build, but they were so contextual. They really responded to the environment, to the weather. I think the most important message I'm trying to say that architects are not service providers, we are an experience provider. We are a social provider. We have a very important, and I think I'm just trying to
moral
message to the architects
perhaps.
that we don't just provide, we don't just pay the check and deliver the design and next project. Design and architecture should provoke emotions, whether you like it or you don't like it, but it provokes emotions. You feel something when you.
What kind of emotions?
Hopefully positive emotions. Like I've been personally to a few buildings where I genuinely was walking around with a smile on my face. I was happy that I'm in this building. Going back to the point, is subjective. Modern architects, some people will tell you Daniel Libeskind, beautiful architect, amazing architecture. Some people, they can't even look at his architecture. So that's why I'm saying it's subjective, because it's tasteless. It doesn't belong. I'm not criticizing Daniel Libeskind. I'm just in general giving an example. Sorry?
I can criticize him for you.
I don't like his style at all.
But Tariq is right that it makes it more difficult when it is not very strongly rooted in context. And that is where we are all struggling, because our context is also changing very rapidly. Our values are adapting to the fact that we are changing very rapidly. And I don't think we have to fear that. We just have to understand what is happening and then adapt to that.
We have to fear that because our values are messed up.
Yeah.
But I don't think that's necessarily true either, because we see like there are genuinely constructions that don't need to be happening, that are not necessarily the most efficient option, and yet they just do it anyway.
They exist.
And it's like, why?
Museums are unsustainable, and they still make those museums and those designs even though they're unsustainable.
At Zahadid Architects, our built portfolio was primarily done on public buildings, museums, culture buildings, buildings which were trying to find that momented culture when people could engage with it. But it has shifted. How many really great public buildings are being commissioned? It's not happening. It's much more developers. And then, yes, having this larger vision, bringing ethos or philosophy to the design is much more difficult.
Carl, what do you think? I mean, is architecture's highest calling to solve practical problems, or is it to evoke some sort of emotion, like to elevate the human spirit? Can it be both functional and transcendent, or not possible?
It should be functional. It should be lasting, or it should provide like some kind of security, like
should it evoke emotions?
A shelter. But then is the third thing that because this is like Vitruvius' three principles that you obviously know, and then is the third that he stated that it should be pleasing to the eye.
Oh my God, I love this guy.
Vitruvius is known as the father of architecture. He talks about three principles, which is venustas, utilitas, and firmitas, which is functionality, utility, and aesthetics. And these three principles are very core to the essence of what architecture means to us.
We are talking very much about how times have changed, how we are utilizing things, how we have to fulfill practical needs. And yes, that's of course important. But then the last thing, what should we strive for within architecture on that last bit, how it looks? Because it has to look one way or another. Should we strive towards making it look pleasing to the eye, or should we make it look shocking or provocative, or purposefully disharmonious? So, for instance, in Norway, we have this governmental main building that was built in brutalist architecture. All the windows are similar, and the architect had an idea about it that since society should be equal, then you should not be able to see what office is the Prime Minister's office. And it's like, okay, it's an interesting idea, but it has not taken into account that the building is completely ugly. No ornamentation, no
Yes. Oh
harmony,
my
nothing.
God.
It's just
Yes.
following that idea and for the sake of the idea itself, instead of taking into account that it should look beautiful too, and also promote some kind of idea.
It's supposed to represent that the government is supposed to serve the people. So I actually think that here it being ugly serves a purpose.
I don't know.
I think that his example is actually the worst example
You will
of that.
find
It's
that
like-
logic. You will find that logic in every building if you go beyond saying this is ugly.
What we are lacking in our societies is having a bit of kind of, I won't call it monitoring, but steering committees in cities and districts about how to avoid the problem of having a big building, a huge building in a great location because it was the result of satisfying an architect's ego. I think what we are lacking also, a committee of architects, socialists, artists, civilians who actually can look subjectively about the projects.
Right. I mean,
We
yeah, go ahead.
definitely do not need more regimentation. I mean, so
But the point is, again, he just picked a very good example of a building in Norway, which is a public building.
that's
and
the
that building
socialist
was,
approach, right? You are just describing a socialist rationalism expression.
But he's talking about
isn't it? So-
an architect's feeling at that specific moment that I want to design a building looks like that. And we quite often, we have very big ego as an architect. And we always try to reflect our identity and our thoughts of thinking, and we always push for our ideas. And sometimes we try to convince the client of things because we believe internally, genuinely believe that this is the best product to have.
That's why we need a standard of taste.
But it's impossible to standardize a taste.
You do not standardize. You just have standards of taste that is a place of consensus, a place of social agreement.
What's going to be in that standard? I'm so curious.
There can be a standard.
Exactly. It's not impossible at all.
On one hand, I don't want to say that an English village is better than a Filipino village, right? I don't want to say there's a hierarchy of beauty. I think all cultures are beautiful in their own way. But at the same time, if beauty is just subjective, then that means we have architects who literally build buildings without any consideration to the local community. So they build something that is a completely brutalist design in the middle of, let's say, a very rustic German village, for example, which I think is completely wrong. I think it destroys the harmony in that.
When I'm talking about committees, I'm not asking for adding a layer of stopping us from creating beautiful architecture. It's basically looking at for the certain aspects. Is this building reflecting the environment, respecting the environment? Is this building adding a social aspect of that one? Is that building adding a value?
Badisha?
Well, I was just going to say, because I've cut my teeth mostly in UK, and the United Kingdom, and especially London, has a notorious planning process, which is, and we've even had projects which have been audited externally for design. Not that, it doesn't give rise to a mix of good, bad, ugly architecture, but there is quite a rigorous process there. And what I was going to add earlier is perhaps we are focusing too much on the formal kind of aesthetics, because I've personally, for example, delivered a school, it's now a decade or more ago, in Brixton, an extremely tough neighborhood in London, very high crime rate, and they didn't have a senior secondary school. And we created a school which connected the community together. Now, if you looked at it critically based on what I'm hearing right now, you could come out and say it is a phenomenally ugly building. But we put a lot of thought into setting it back so it's not overwhelming, how you're connecting different communities, different kids who are coming together. And it became one of the, projects on the back of which Zaha won her second Sterling Prize. But we also got criticized by locals saying, well, it's not pretty, it's not colorful, it's kind of silver.
Wait, that means the building's ugly.
But if it served its purpose, which was helping kids
okay, but you
come
could have served the
together and
purpose without
connect.
it being
You can serve that purpose without being ugly.
She didn't say that there were
Not
budget
really,
restrictions.
though. Not
She
really.
just
It's not about that. It's because the neighborhood looked a certain way, they didn't want to make it stand out and look too off. So they made it look the same as everything. And that's why they say that they may see it as ugly, because it blends with the neighborhood.
The fact that it had a huge social impact, which was positive, it regenerated that area. It gave hope to the kids, most of whom came from very poor families. For me, that outweighs far more that some people thought the building is not quite beautiful.
Is that one of the responsibilities of architects, Marwa, to connect the community and prevent social isolation, perhaps?
Of course, I mean, modernism was the basis of segregation. So the social utopia that was dreamt of by the modernist architects after the war was one that relied on segregation and relied on zoning, rigid zoning. And like I said in the beginning, the tide is changing now. We do not have this place of social agreement anymore. We do not have the standard of taste. We do not have the spiritual bedrock. I think it's difficult to create a new idiom now under what I call the factory system that encourages more and more building of the wrong type.
Oh my God, let's talk about corporate buildings, please.
Think of what sort of building you're making here, right? That's sort of like a bone I have to pick with architects in general, where they pretend to, like, you know, act like holier than thou, but like, you just do what the client wants. I do think the clients have a much, much higher responsibility of being cognizant of the societies and communities they're part of.
It's difficult for architects to stick their necks out and challenge these systems.
What about those who say, go ahead.
No,
go ahead.
I was saying that, I mean, that is a aspect. It is not that absolutely everything which is being built in the built environment today is irresponsible. There's a lot of factors and variables, but I would not say that everything is completely the wrong direction.
I'm not saying everything. I said, but I know that big names, big architects are just, you know, following the trend of the market. So whatever the market says.
I agree with her, but like, again, the tide is not changing. If anything, we need to be sounding the alarm. The way city design is going in a lot of cities is not going to end up with good architecture.
They are still utilitarian, they are still self-referential, they are still doing more damage than good.
What is the damage?
Architects were responsible of civic buildings and buildings that appealed to, like I said in the beginning, to a social agreement. And this social agreement is being all the time hindered by those bombardments of those buildings that cannot actually make up their minds. I mean, you have these creations like Daniel Lipkin's and these Zaha Hadid earlier portfolio where you have like spaceship kind of building landing on the plots. You know, they cannot make up their mind anymore.
So, Tariq, you wanted to comment on what Marwa had to say. Also, what about those who say, look, architecture has become a proxy war for broader fears of cultural loss and globalization? Is that something that you see going on?
I think we need to understand how important our role in the society. It's a fundamental, big responsibility we have on our shoulders. And I'm just, for example, referring to the point of having spaceship landing here and there. I have a soft spot towards Zaha, so I have to defend that point, because maybe you don't, or we don't like certain buildings and they look alien and they don't look contextual, but in the same time, certain architects, they played a pivotal role in improving the industry in general.
There's no doubt in that.
Okay, so let's ignore the building that we messed up, but guys, they did a great job elsewhere.
No, he didn't say ignore
no,
the
that's
building.
literally what he said.
No, he's saying that
He's
set a
saying because of the
standard.
building, the industry progressed.
Exactly, yeah. Remember what I said? One building, one white tower can inspire other white towers.
That is such a bad claim. That is such a bad claim.
My definition of modernism is this big definition of this break with tradition, that it's breaking with tradition for the sake of breaking, and that has led to what we see many results of today, which I do think has ended up being kind of a battleground, where buildings are are almost identical in north and south and east and west, that it's hard to see differences, not because differences necessarily are good in themselves, but they are often connected to the environment. So I do think that there's a value of keeping those local traditions.
Marwa, on the point that Carl was making on colonization a moment ago, what is the role of architecture here in erasing that memory of colonization?
Very good question.
And when you look at the Arab world, when you look at a lot of cities in the Arab world, unfortunately bombed out due to wars and unrest, what is the role of architecture there in kind of keeping people in this perpetual state of war?
Well, actually, this is something that led me to write a book about the role of architecture in conflicts. The French colonization, for example, of Syria, had employed an architect in order to reshape the Syrian cities and in order to make Syria modern. And this is a story that happened all across the Muslim world after the fall of the Ottomans. So different architects, international architects, were stationed in different parts of the Muslim world in order to, quote unquote, modernize the Muslim lands. And through the process of modernization, they captured the landscape of cities by airplane, and they actually sat behind their desks on top of those maps and created new vision of the city by eliminating the role of the old Islamic city. So in the old
erasing identity, you mean?
Basically, the end result was erasing identity, but what they did is that they created a mode of segregation and categorization. So, for example, they in the old Islamic city, you had no differences basis on wealth. You had different backgrounds living together. The French, on the other hand, had eluded the rich people from the old city, claiming that it was, less of a prestige to them, and created new boulevard houses, creating this class division. They also created different neighborhoods where the Christian lived in the Christian sections and the Muslim lived in another. And by that, they created seeds of antagonism amongst different groups and societies. They created a social stigma to the local ideal, and with that, people became to hate their own self-expression and look at the Western imported, more progressive products to create their own places and change their own places, even if that went against every atom in their own being.
Do you agree? Hugely important role there?
I do agree, but I don't necessarily agree that these colonizations, especially in the relevant country, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Palestine, because for me, when I think about a Syrian house personally, I think about the old Arabic house, the courtyard, and the mezzanine level. So I don't think they really took the identity.
No, they did, but I mean, like I said, they built alternative residences and new neighborhoods, and they suffocated the old city, even urbanly. So it was very deliberate, very systematic.
Colonization has taken its toll when it came to traditional aesthetics, traditional architecture. Now, what the post-colonial world has to do is, how do we reckon with that? How do we go back to our roots, while also acknowledging our own histories? What does it mean to live in a building that was built and thought of not by your people, but by the people who oppressed you?
Any civilization, any colonization will try to influence the shape of the city, the lifestyle, especially if they know that they're leaving, so they're trying to maintain kind of the impact and the influence of their power onto the city. But I think now we going back to the concept of, we have lots of Arab cities, unfortunately they've been destructed.
Right.
But now there's a hope of replanning new cities in the right way that reflects our identity and reflects our roots and reflect our kind of, who we are as a nation.
By replanting new cities, do we lose our sense of identity, Badisha?
No, I think it's an opportunity to reinforce and express what our current identity is. History happens and you have to learn, and I read somewhere that, you may not repeat its mistakes, but you'll find new ways to make mistakes. But I remain hopeful that as a building process, we are able to learn from where things might not have gone right before and create new cities which reinforce our current identities and values.
Carl.
Yeah, I think there are many very important and great ideas here, but I do not think that they should exclude to the quest for building beautifully, because there are many things that you can do to protect your local identity, your culture, and also fulfill the societal needs, bridging youth, for instance, in difficult areas, or building according to technical requirements and everything, but you can still build in a beautiful way that respects tradition, that is harmonious, and that is built for humans and not for bird views on postcards.
Okay, well, this is an excellent time to check in with our students. So throughout this debate, our panel of students and recent graduates has been carefully listening to everything you've said, to all your ideas and all of your arguments. So next, I'll join them as they reflect and they deliberate on what they've just heard. And after their discussion, they'll return to share their own perspectives along with questions and challenges.
I feel like it is very human for them to have different views on different points, but it's just that as I was sitting there, the more they spoke, the more confused I became, and I was like, okay, who am I with? What points do I like? What points did I not like? At some point, it just became like blank.
There were moments where I completely disagreed, and it almost made me furious because these people are the ones that are on almost like front lines, the ones that are building the buildings. And if your conceptions of principles of design or architecture are so skewed, how do you expect for those spaces to do what you want them to do?
I feel like if we listen to them more, especially in, when we meet them on stage, I feel like views will change and that will happen. So I feel like I'm looking forward to see more. Like maybe they will have more time to clarify their points and more times to justify the things that they said.
Hey guys! So, you heard from our speakers just a short while ago. They talked about the concept of beauty, what they think it is. They discussed what makes a building worth preserving. So, Lean, let me ask you, what do you think stood out for you from that conversation? Anything in particular?
The thing that stood out to me the most out of all the really interesting ideas that they came out with was the fact that they couldn't agree to a certain standard in architecture, like the standard of the objective beauty in architecture. So I felt like that was interesting.
Anyone else? Huda?
I think honestly something that stood out to me was the fact that there was a lot of polarity of opinions between them, and then within themselves. I found a lot of the times they were contradicting their own opinions of what they said.
Yes.
Something in particular that I will talk about is the idea when Mr. Tariq mentioned how art and architecture is separate to one another. But then if you see his work, he is implementing the idea of evoking emotion. I found that there was a lot of contradiction amongst that, and then others as well.
Yeah, there was a really cold, sort of cynical view of architecture that we sort of heard, this idea that like architecture is just like purely about like sort of material functionality and doesn't provide any value outside of that.
I disagree.
The pleasure that you derive from seeing a beautiful thing is a function of the building as well.
Exactly.
So hang on then, what was missing from the conversation? Sundus, was there anything missing for you?
I think when we were talking about beauty, they were talking about like the function of it, the utility of it. I think Ms. Sinha was talking about how a lot of buildings have to be made keeping in mind like the purpose of it. Everything has to be made very fast because she's like talking about efficiency, that times have changed. We need these things and we have to get things done and made. Things can like fulfill the purpose of being like useful, being efficient, but also at the same time they can still be beautiful. Why don't we slow down a little bit?
I also want to take from what Sundus was saying, and I think what was also missing was the element of how buildings make us feel. Think about brutalist buildings, for example, how they make you feel small, miniature, powerless versus a whole system that is bigger than you, that is there to overrule you.
Isn't that something that Tariq spoke about? Isn't that something Tariq spoke about? He spoke about that buildings are supposed to bring out emotions, right?
But
Go
ahead.
I want to add, I think what could have been benefited here and perhaps added a realistic dimension to this discussion was who has the right to experience beauty in our society today, right? Because you go to like a slum in the Philippines, for example, and these people could not see beauty in their lives.
There was also the example, there's the example of the house that was, or sorry, not the house, what was it, a secondary education building or something along those lines. I think the idea that, because it's currently a crime-riddled area, you build it as if it's going to be like that permanently, I fundamentally
Also,
reject
the
that
locals
idea.
said it's ugly.
The whole point, if the locals think it's ugly, and it's this idea of also just like, you're trying to build a happy, beautiful community, but instead of doing that, you're building as if it's always going to be a struggling, crime-filled community. I disagree with the way that it was gone about.
I mean, look,
Why,
if
Huda?
she built...
I'll tell you why I disagree with it, because I feel in this context really, really matters. When we're talking about how the locals feel it's ugly, we have to consider that the main inhabitants of this space are the occupants. And they are going through something which is a result that is reflected in the building itself. I'm not saying it needs to be ugly,
But
so to say,
why reflect
but
the
I'm
bad
saying that
context is the
it's not
question.
it's not about bad context. It's that there are psychological implications when you consider design principles. Buildings are not designed in a unidimensional manner where you're just considering what the skin looks like. So by skin, I mean the facade, what the outdoor, the exterior looks like. It's really important to acknowledge that architecture extends beyond the outdoor threshold, and that you really you experience architecture in its truest form when you are within the space.
They talked a lot about like how standards are made and stuff like that, and how previously it was like princely court or like the imperial workshops or so on and so forth, right? Nowadays, there was a counter argument to that we still have standards, like you have planning commissions and stuff like that. But then to that I argue that if you look at Shanghai, right, like the big building with the square in the middle, right, like when it was designed and it was created, it was approved by a planning commission. When it went public, every single local went up in an uproar because they disliked the design of the building. So that just goes to show how disconnected these standard or planning commissions are from the actual local population.
On the point of inequality,
I think we're looking at two different things, aesthetics and functionality. I think for those particular architects, their main goal was in terms of the functionality to bring people together, because what use would it have been if the building were to be beautiful but people are still not coming together and the same societal problems that exist are still there?
But that's a false dichotomy.
Think about, for example, the race for the tallest tower, the construction of the Burj Khalifa. The Burj Khalifa is not an efficient building, right? It actually, like, if we're talking like purely economically, the Burj Khalifa should not exist. But it does anyway, because there is this intent to build a structure like that. So I reject the idea that things are only becoming, sort of more boring, less ornamental, purely because it's more functional. That's simply not true. And again, as we mentioned, beauty is a function of the building.
Wahed, let me ask you, is function the highest priority, or where do you draw the line on what's good enough?
I don't think so, because when we talk about the Burj Khalifa, the point was to prove to humanity that we can do something great, that we can build something so tall. And that's why function does matter in a lot of cases. But in some cases, it's not about function. It's also about aesthetics and to prove a point.
Go ahead.
I would like to just comment on something you mentioned about whether functionality is front and center. I do partly agree with what Wahed has said about the fact that functionality is not always the case, but it goes back to what Mr. Kahl mentioned about Vitruvius. He's known as the father of architecture, and he talks about how architecture is rooted with three principles of functionality, utility, and aesthetics. It can be a symbiotic relationship where a space is both functional, it's utility, you see a utility, and it's designed for beauty or aesthetics. I don't think it needs to be one over the other.
My country's government from the Philippines actually builds like suburban neighborhoods, but they are often the same houses, like repeated over and over again. And the reason for that is the rationalization of architecture, the idea that if you build something over and over again, you basically drive down the costs and you basically get affordable housing. I think what I would have loved for the speakers to have said was, how does the housing crisis figure into this, right?
Yes.
How do we temper with the rationalization of architecture? When it comes to ultimately the reason why we have these modernist architectures that do not really inspire beauty, right? That's a product of the housing crisis. That's a product of people wanting more affordable housing. So what the government does is that they shave off the beauty. As long as people have a roof over their heads, they're satisfied, no matter how ugly that is, or no matter how unpleasing that is. People would advocate, but beauty is a right, and then the governments would say, no, this is a frivolous cost. This is just discretionary spending.
I want to push back a little bit on the whole social housing or like affordable housing has to be ugly. It doesn't have to be ugly. Like if you look at if you go to like outside of Vienna, like if you look at Austria, if you look at so many places in China, right? Like you see affordable housing that is community centric, that is actually accessible to people, right? So I think the whole idea that just because it's new or just because it's made efficiently, it has to be ugly is not necessarily the case. Sure, maybe you won't have the ornamentation, but you can have better designed buildings that serve their function because of how they're designed, right? Like
Vienna has the district of Alterla, which has like these huge, I mean, not my favorite type of architecture, obviously, but these huge sort of modern, almost ziggurat-like towers with like community-centered construction. It's these sort of like, social-based housing that, I mean, it works, right? And it's still an incredible construction.
I want to add something to this. I just want to...
Could I, before,
sure.
right? And also, I want to say, in the debate, I felt like there was a lot of demonization of colonial architecture. I don't think that's necessarily the most productive way we can spend our time, because let's face it, right? Like, a lot of times, colonial architecture is fairly pretty. Go to Cape Town, go to Malaysia, look at the old train stations, right? Like, we see these buildings because, obviously, they were made for the colonizers. They were exclusionary, but they were beautiful because they wanted them to be beautiful, right?
Can I add,
Colonial legacies apparently still impact a lot of people's brains. I'm just like at this point, get over it. You know what I mean? Like, if colonial legacies exist, it's because you allow them to exist, right? Like, I'm not disagreeing that colonialism was bad or it did a lot of bad stuff. But if you're saying you have a colonized mind, then that is your problem squarely now.
I completely agree with your point, Mudassar, because if you ask a lot of Egyptians, at least in Alexandria, where I came from, one of the prettiest parts, architecture-wise, are actually the buildings that came following the colonial era in Egypt after the British and the French invasion. When you look at, like a country that's thousands and thousands and thousands of years old, you can appreciate different parts and different eras, right?
It doesn't make you feel like your identity is muted?
I mean, absolutely not, because we just brought Egyptian living spaces in these areas, right? And if anything, we kind of took over some of that building and we made it Egyptian in its own way.
It's also a reflection of the history of who we are, right? So I mean, when we talk about traditional Iraqi architecture, there's never been an independent state in Iraq since the Mongol sack of Baghdad. Most of our architecture is largely influenced by Turkish culture, by Persian culture, and then by a British invasion. And so, but yet, we still call it Iraqi architecture. We still think that this reflects our history of who we are. And I don't think that there's anything particularly wrong with that.
I was reading a novel by a Palestinian-American novelist, Ibtisam Azam, called The Book of Disappearance. Alaa, the main Palestinian character, basically said, this journalist who works in Jaffa, every time he crosses from Jaffa to Tel Aviv, from the predominantly Arab buildings, and seeing all these Bauhaus imported designs into Tel Aviv, he feels strangled. It feels as if, when he sees the Hebrew street names, that he's being whipped directly. So I think it's also important to envision architecture within the existing power structures at play, right? I mean, Iraq, for example, has been independent for, some time now. But for Palestinians, that oppression is a lived reality.
Yeah, but you just answered your own question. You're sort of agreeing with Amir there, right? It's an issue because that occupation is ongoing. For them, it's gone. The British.
To be honest,
aren't.
Mudassar, just because they're not there doesn't mean the occupation is not ongoing. There is colonial legacy.
Guys, let me ask you this. I mean, how do you define beauty? And what do you think it is? Wahed, I'll come to you first. What do you think it is? Why are people so emotionally charged when they look at a building? What is it?
The most beautiful things in life are things that you don't realize are beautiful. And when it comes to architecture, whenever I see a building that's just there, that's just existing in the horizon, that doesn't attract me in a certain way, I'm like, that is a beautiful building. It exists in its own way, and it's not begging for attention.
Because it's harmonious, right?
I agree with what you're saying.
That's interesting. Carl, what about you? How do you see beauty?
I actually perfectly agree with what Ed is trying to say. At least my conception of what beauty in terms of architecture would look like is you need to see it and you need to feel something within you. When you look at cultural buildings that have withstood time, you get to have this sense of feeling that's attached with that particular building, and that in itself already informs you of what beauty really is.
But I think beauty is highly subjective. So when you we're talking, like, is it in the eyes of the beholder?
And Carl said no.
And I agree with
Beauty is
Carl.
in the eyes of the beholder, basically.
Yeah.
I think it's so subjective. We're humans.
But architecture is
what I
different.
like, it might not be what she likes.
I think beauty is actually the most objective thing on earth. And here's how it's objective.
I want to hear from
right?
this side.
Here's
Go on.
how it's
Yeah.
objective. Sure. You know what you do? You take a picture of the building, put 100 people in front of it, rate it out of 10. There's your objectivity.
No.
Guys, you say no.
Not at all.
You say no,
Okay,
both of you
so-
say no. So those first and then Lina.
There could be a building that someone finds depressing and another person can find it comforting. As Wahid said, maybe a building that looks like ugly and nobody's paying attention to it, he finds it beautiful because his idea of beauty is something else. Who is to say that you have a standard and you're saying, this is objective,
But there's
everybody
such
just
a
has to
big
believe it?
disconnect, right?
Lina, let's hear from Lina.
Look,
Yeah.
I just want to say, I feel like you guys are conflating art with architecture, right? Art definitely is subjective. Architecture is a whole different thing. I think you need a measure of objectivity. Not all of it, but there is a measure, because that's why we find beautiful symmetrical buildings beautiful, right? That's why sometimes intentional asymmetry is beautiful.
My definition of beauty might be more agreeable, which is that it does have some standards. So for example...
What are they?
I'll tell you.
Tell me.
So firstly, it has to be easy to maintain, not just from like hygiene-wise, but also when something goes wrong, you can fix it easily at low cost if possible. That is the beauty of it from a more technical side. And then if you look at it from the consumer's side, it has to cater to their well-being. What does their well-being entail? It has to also it focuses on how they feel, which is what everyone has been mentioning, which is a very important and core value. Why? Because buildings are things we enter and genuinely experience. And it's not just a piece of art that we look at and say goodbye to. It's something that we need to use for our day-to-day lives, right? So I feel like the way we feel is important, and also our physical well-being is important as well. It has to be incorporated. Like, for example, it doesn't necessarily have to be buildings, but architecture like Jiwan Island, allowing us to walk around. At least there's some form of cold air going around, helping us to breathe a little better.
Jiwan Island in Qatar that you're referring to.
Yeah.
Okay.
So there's that, and also regional differences, where buildings has to cater to local differences, and if it was disaster prone, or if it needed to take care of the heat, like not let in too much heat or hold too much heat. So I feel like when you put all of these three elements together, you can have a beautiful building, because not only does it mix objective criteria, but it also mixes subjective criteria, which is the way we feel. So the point that I'm trying to say here is that beauty should be attributed to the people that genuinely use this building, and not just by bystanders or onlookers.
And that's a point that other people made as well. But the way Lean crafted that entire sentence, and I was like, hold on, that is beauty. And that just completely changed my opinion from being subjective to being exactly what Lean said. I think it was not just me. Since that point, no one mentioned beauty again.
Our city is now kind of being built to just show off. And
Absolutely. And I think
you guys all think so?
I think another thing that I was talking about was, not just the fact that we already know that, cities are looking more similar, the classic, like glass skyline, whatever. But also, for example, we actually see that modern construction in the Middle East is actually highly unsustainable, right? Modern Middle Eastern cities are incredibly unwalkable, are filled with more and more modernist constructions that only make the situation worse.
Modernist architecture in and of itself is a style, right? There are unique, modernist architectural buildings, like the Pentagon, for example, with its brutalist design, and it conveys the power, the military power of the United States in a very effective way, right? But I think that when it comes to modernist architecture, I hope we recognize the diversity of that and the diversity of schools.
For example, in Baghdad, one of the last buildings that will have been designed by Zaha Hadid is Iraq's new central bank, right? It stands right on the Tigris. It is an imposing, tall, white building with glass, right? And so, usually that might be the type of building that I actually might not like. But I think there's a purpose to it, right? It's imposing because it's representing a new era, right? This is Iraq's new central bank. It's a new day. Iraq's moving into the modern era. That is an example in which, modernist architecture can be useful. But then again, when we see, for example, there are new suburbs being built in Baghdad with the classic colorless white, gray, blackish, single-family modern home being constructed, which not just doesn't look nice, but also encourages unsustainable urban planning practices. That's when I'm just like, okay, well then this shouldn't be normalized.
Here, theoretical kind of question, and this could have many layers, but I'd really like to get your take on it. When you think of a place like Gaza, for example, completely destroyed, right? 90% of the building's gone. It has to rebuild. Which direction should it go in? Who wants to start? Lean.
I feel like it should go towards the direction of restoration to how they used to be. And basically, because that's the point, it's what empowers our resistance to hold on to our tradition and how we, and basically the Palestinian culture as a whole, our
identity?
dance, our identity, because this is what Israelis are doing. They're stealing it away from us. So I feel like when we rebuild our city, or when Palestine wants to rebuild, it should go throughout the path of restoration. But like, we fought for it and we took it back and we reclaimed it as ours. So I feel like that's the most
disagree,
powerful.
actually, because I think the architecture of Gaza is an architecture of colonization, is an architecture of occupation, right? Most people who are from Gaza are not actually from Gaza, right? They're refugees. Gaza is filled with incredibly dense apartment buildings that are legacies of colonialism, right? When Gaza is rebuilt, I don't want to see Gaza look exactly the way it did before, right? Because I mean, ideally, the problem is that the construction of the entire city was incredibly cramped, filled with, not very well constructed apartment buildings, like many refugee camps in the West Bank as well, like Ain al-Hilwa in Lebanon. These sorts of constructions are legacies of colonialism. So, I mean, ideally, I would want a city that is more like old Beirut or old Jerusalem, and a little less like, for example, Ain al-Hilwa.
Sarah first. You want to say something?
I think when we are rebuilding a colonized space, or a country that's been under occupation, we finally have a chance to rebuild those houses. I think we need to keep in mind that it has to be in a community way. It has to be very accessible because of amputees, because of a lot of people who can't go to a certain place through stairs and these things. There has to be conscious effort that I feel like sometimes people don't make, and there has to be a distinction. What's before the colonization, what was our identity before, and what's after, and how do we feel in the current identity, which I think the speaker spoke about.
Everyone here is looking at it from a very noble perspective. You want the best for Gazans and all that. But that thinking in and of itself is a form of colonization. I think how Gaza should be rebuilt is how the Palestinians want it to be rebuilt. I don't think we should have says on what's good for them, and they should tell us if they want 80 apartment blocks built together, that is what they should want. You can't look at it from the perspective of, oh no, but this is the best thing for you. No, it's you've just gone through an extremely traumatic event. So I think the most important perspective on how Gaza should be, Gaza or Gaza, however you want to pronounce it, should be rebuilt is the Palestinian perspective. How do they want it to be rebuilt?
Okay, Wahid.
For me, speaking of Gaza is a pretty sensitive topic because I have a lot of friends who are in Gaza. And when I asked one of them whose house recently got blown up, I was like, hey, bro, because we're joking about it, we're close friends. I'm like, how do you want your new house to be built? And he was like, I just want a roof over my head. That's all I want. The first step should be reconstruction. And then in the future, after everyone has healed properly in their hearts and in their souls, they can think of building something big and spectacular.
Sorry, I'm picking up from, what Mudassar was saying. I think we all agree that, yes, they should build whatever it is that they want. But as what Sarah was saying, how they can now move on, rebuild their society. So I think that's maybe where you were not necessarily focusing on. I think for those who are in Gaza, what's going to be important is how they're going to restructure their society and make sure that they rebuild and reclaim their identity as they move forward.
Yeah. John Carlos,
A lot of us, talk about moving on and building on a new Gaza, but I think it's just as important to have a place for memory. I could imagine it would be beyond a monument, but I know the Palestinians have every right to determine, how they memorialize what has happened in Gaza over the past few decades. But, when you look at a place like Berlin, you would still see bullet holes from World War II. And they purposefully kept it that way. In Hiroshima, we think of that building that was just left there, destroyed, as a reminder of what the city had gone through. So I think when we are reconstructing Gaza, I think we shouldn't erase that memory architecturally.
I was just going to say that.
Yeah.
Lynn, this means a lot to you, this conversation. What are you thinking? No? Okay. We'll give you a moment and we'll come back to you. Sarah, you're feeling emotional too.
Yeah,
Why?
It's crazy because whenever I speak to IDPs, internally displaced people in Sudan or in Gaza, it's unimaginable what they go through when they leave their homeland. Some of them will can never come back, and they know it when they're leaving. I literally have heard this so many times. I know I will never see this place again, so let me turn back and look at everything, even though I know it's all on the ground, but let me just look at everything one last time.
And they don't know if they were ever live to ever see it rebuilt, or if it will ever be rebuilt the same way. It's more of letting go. It's so brutal because this is genocide, this is erasure. Colonialism, we've seen some of it remain, but here nothing will remain.
I think the worst part is we don't even know if it's going to be rebuilt by Palestinians, because even now there's force. There's a country that's being involved from up there. The U.S. is being involved in this. They're like, we want to build something else. How dare someone come up and be like, we want to claim this, and the fact that this can go on and other people don't want to say anything is really insane to me.
Lynn, do you want to say anything now? Tell us what you're feeling. What are you thinking?
That this conversation feels pretentious. Because when Mudassir said that it should be how they want it to be, I felt like, oh my God, it feels so selfish of me, I guess, that, okay, this is what I think, this is a movement and empowerment, but then, I don't know, it's so sad.
Something that we all sort of had a moment with was the question regarding rebuilding Gaza. I think that's something that it touched a lot of our chords, because I think we were thinking about what that could look like, and essentially the conversation then it went off to being that the agency should always lie with them.
Well, guys, this has been a really powerful conversation. It's been a very emotional conversation. You guys have gone really deep. But the conversation is not over yet. There's a lot more to talk about amongst ourselves and also with our experts. So are you all ready to meet them face to face?
Absolutely.
I think just seeing my friends Lina and Sarah kind of open up and get emotional, that was really hard for me, because it reminded me of a few of my old friends who are in Gaza now. And I've not heard from them for months, and I have no idea how they are.
I could see someone that, slouched down, and I was like, oh, and then she was crying. I could hear her crying, and then and that was it. I started crying, and I was like, seriously, how are we young people ever going to recover from this?
So I felt very unprepared, but listening to all my peers and their answers felt very nice, especially Mudassir's answers and Sarah. I felt like, well, that's really considerate. I didn't think about it that way, and I felt like it's a refreshing perspective, and I felt like it was important for me to hear as well. So yeah.
So we're back in our majlis, and just a short while ago, we heard from the students where we spoke about everything related to architecture, what we had spoken about with the experts. We spoke about beauty, we spoke about functionality, we spoke about civilization. We also spoke about reconstruction, specifically in war-torn countries. When we spoke about Gaza, it was a very powerful and emotionally charged conversation that took place. Marwa, from what you heard, and what would you like to say to the students about Gaza?
Well, I think from what I heard and from what I lived, I come from a country that has been also war-torn. I mean, in Syria, the Syrian population paid a heavy price, and they went through tragedies perhaps not comparable to the current genocide that is taking place in Gaza because of the relentless killing machine by the Israelis. But the students raised many important points when they gave the agency to the Gazan people, and that was very responsible and humble point of view. Palestinian people continue to live under the Israeli occupation, and it's an occupation that has an agenda to eradicate. It won't at any moment allow for space of genuine reconstruction. So to imagine a future while the knife of the killer is still on the necks of the Palestinian people would be unrealistic in my view. That only can take place in a future of peace, and it's a future that should be free. And unless there is freedom for Palestine, there cannot be a moment that could be compared to the aftermath of the World War II. For example, when you know the example of Japan and Germany was also mentioned through that debate. And I guess it's a different scenario in Palestine. A final point I would like to say is that Gaza should be given the credit not only for this monumental resistance of this honorable people, but also how they managed to live through the siege during the previous decades. And they kept their beaches free, they kept their property distributed, they kept their agriculture local. This is a situation that was born from hardship, but it should be compared with the dreams of Trump, for example, when he spoke about creating a Riviera. And in Syria, there are Syrian people actually, who proposed a Trump Tower. And this could be as painful as the destruction when you propose an idealization of this American model that is based on consumerism and based on tourism and based on taking the property and taking the agency of people by creating those luxurious creations.
Mudassar, you're nodding your head, and you, in the discussion that we were having before, you were one of the students who raised the point of who are we to decide how Palestinians rebuild Gaza?
You have to ask the local people actually what they want, right? And that's the number one thing. And I think architects, us as city planners, or like whoever is the stakeholder, needs to recognize the fact that it is ultimately the local people that have the highest form of agency, and you shouldn't impose your will on them.
Leen, what would you like to say?
I mean, I honestly totally agree with Mudassar's point. Although I felt at the time like, okay, this was probably the best answer, but then when he came up and said, no, it depends on what they wanted, it kind of gave me like a big picture view. Like, it really is, you know, like especially when they're under genocide and they're facing horrible atrocities every day, the last thing they need is more people controlling them and more people putting more things onto them, like, and pushing more agendas onto them. Like, their agency is the most important thing. They need to regain control. They need to be able to have that peace, to be able to connect back to what they were, you know?
But I have to say something here, that from the Syrian experience, you have to remember that people will continue the survival mode for longer than you expect. People on the whole will be missing many years of maturity as a society. The social sentiment and the public aspiration would be fragmented and would be very weak, and people would be feeling helplessness for so many years that they would seek to compensate that with anything on the table.
Sarah, tell us what you're thinking as you listen to this conversation.
There's a lot of rebuilding to do, rebuilding emotionally and physically, and to give each other the support that I think everyone there needs for generations to come. I think this is generational trauma that even after 100 years, kids are going to open history books and read about this, and they're going to feel that, oh, our ancestors really went through a hard time.
I think if the people from Gaza decided to build the pyramids there of Giza, it's absolutely up to them. They can do whatever they want, but they still need our help. Meaning that I think the biggest victim in Gaza, from my point of view, are the children. The children who, some families completely are lost. I mean, they're 1-2 years old, born during the conflict and seen tragedies. how we can do architecture, how we can reconstruct, and making sure these buildings, these architectures are helping the children to pass that kind of phase of their life.
Huda, you're nodding along. What do you think? I mean, is there a role that architecture plays in giving that emotional support?
Absolutely. I think architecture, in its essence, it is meant to evoke emotion, good, bad, subjective. But I think what she mentioned specifically about Gaza and also what Mudassir mentioned, agency is really centric to all of this. So we are recognizing their stories and their narratives, and we have to weave that into the practice, the architectural spatial practice within.
When that occupation is, very much real, right? I think there is power there, and that power coincides with that person, just subjugating the colonized. When it comes to reconstructing, especially the destructive scenes as we've seen in the genocide in Gaza, I think that even like destroying homes itself, even though if they're not architecturally pleasing, even though if they're the most gentrified neighborhoods out there in Manila or in the United States, for example, that mere destruction of home means a lot to people, right? And that definition of what does home look like for all of us is very powerful.
Amir, you brought up the central bank building in Iraq that was built by Zaha Hadid. Let's talk a little bit about architecture and this path to reconciliation. Okay, so how do you think, I'm going to ask my guest this, but Amir, first, just tell us about the example that you had brought up and why you think it's an important one.
So, even though I'm largely, a critic and not a huge fan of, the modernist architectural style, I think one of the great exceptions to this is the new central bank in Iraq. The reason it's important is because it's this, imposing, tall, white building with glass looking over the coast on the Tigris River. And basically what this does is it represents a new modern era for Baghdad as a city. You can see it everywhere. I mean, like Baghdad's skyline is very, very low. It's not a city that tends to have many high-rise buildings. And so for me to be, literally across the river or in a different district in town and still see this like tall white building in the distance, it always serves as a reminder that things are getting better, that Iraq is entering a new age, that, it's not as bad as it used to be.
Batisha, what do you think? I mean, do these kind of structures aid in reconciliation?
I think so. And when the project came to us, it was with this grander idea that you're rebuilding the narrative of this city. And very frequently, a lot of projects like this, they become almost a point of orientation, the starting point of a new story. And it is really important that a city, again, regains an identity and starts to build a new story. Because in the end, we do tell a story. We are here to almost create fact out of something which is a dream. And I think the CBI building definitely is positioned for that. That's the beauty of it.
12 years ago when I was at Zaha, I had the privilege to work in the central bank when we just started the central bank. One of the reasons, and this is about how architecture should also reflect the environment, the surroundings, and the brief. One of the reasons why the tower is also standing in that kind of monumental kind of look and feel, one, to deliver a message, of course, but also it was a purely addressing the brief of security. That time when the building was built, was designed, Baghdad was not the Baghdad we know now. So they had to make sure that there's the least amount of surface exposed on a street level. So that's why you see most of the building is on a high rise, on a tower. So again, it's how the architects are looking at all the aspects. And this is the true message and role of an architect, looking at the brief, the challenges, the problems of a site, the problems of the client, how to address these problems. So I think it was a perfect example of delivering a message of new Iraq, of dignity, of power, but in the same time, the basic job of an architect of reflecting their brief. What's the client challenges and what are the client's problems?
An architect is not a sole stakeholder when these decisions are made. We have stakeholders like the client, and we've got our developers, and we've got the construction crew. There are all these factors that are necessary to factor in to be able to recognize that it's not just the architect that is doing that. On face value, of course, it is always the architect that is blamed almost for making things the way that they do.
I think it's a very interesting example with the central bank that you mentioned, and I really understand the New Hope aspect of it, and it's very important when it comes to architecture. But then when it is connected to the era, there is a saying that I personally support, that is, if you marry your own time, you become a widow in the next.
Well, actually, I am largely a supporter of traditional architecture, right? So, I mean, that's why I said, like, the central bank is what I see as one of the few exceptions to why some modern architecture can be good. But I think, you know, the thing about being wedded to your own time, though, I don't see a problem with there being a monumental structure dedicated to a new era, because I think personally the most beautiful cities, in my opinion, in the world are the ones that leave marks after every era of history, right? I mean, think about cities like Istanbul, where like the architecture seamlessly transitions from period after period, from era to era, right? And I mean, that's what gives the city a lot of its charm.
Every single student, every single guest had their own opinions about architecture and about history of architecture. So when you put all these different people in a room, they're obviously gonna get loud, and they're gonna express their feelings.
A lot of Alexandrian architecture right now is actually, like, it came from the 1800s and the 1900s during when we were colonized by the British and the French. But we love it. My family loves it. You don't have to like stick to that time, but you can just look at it and respect it, respect the buildings that came out of it. You don't need to demolish it.
Could I respond to that? I think what we're not discussing here is the higher plane of ideas, which is aesthetics. Right? Aesthetics have always historically been imposed on the colonized, right? And how do we decolonize aesthetics? Qatar has done an excellent job at this with the Museum of Islamic Art and with other
National Museum.
Yeah, as well as the National Museum of Qatar, which is, you know, some people would say is modernist, but I think it does well in decolonizing these aesthetics.
I think the issue that we have here is we're thinking that we need to have one instead of the other. So just like in Alexandria with Lina, also in my country we have quite a lot of British architecture.
Zimbabwe.
Exactly, Zimbabwe. But the one good thing that I have seen from my people is, in as much as this was the colonial rhetoric, people are moving back towards what Zimbabwe used to look like before the British came. They're beginning to look at the designs as well as the structure that the buildings had. And I think this is what's going to be important if people are going to reclaim that past. Reclaiming is understanding that you have your culture, you have your identity, you have your history. How are you now going to use the current resources that you have to actually make a better future for your people?
I think bigger than colonial legacies is actually what I believe to be a more pressing issue now, which is this imitation of the West without coercion. I think that's really the threat that we're seeing now, is modern, sometimes also just straight up American, like actually American suburban architecture seeping into the Middle East, instead of thinking, well, how do we build modern, sustainable architecture, you know, taking influence from our own culture, right?
But how do you reconcile this narrative with your celebration of the central bank building? I mean, it's contradictory.
Well, no, I don't think it is, because the central bank is designed to celebrate the beginning of a new era.
As a flag of new colonization, basically.
Well, no, because it's an Iraqi architect. It's built by Iraqis. There are Iraqis in the construction. Iraqis celebrate and love this building. It's an immense pride. I mean, it's totally different from only rich Iraqis being able to purchase a gross.
Well, this might go back to when we were talking about whether beauty is in the eye of the beholder, right? Depends how you see it. So, Marwa, how do you see it?
I mean, I see it as a renewed colonization.
To claim that the central bank is a legacy of colonial.
It's a flag.
In what way? It's designed by an Iraqi. It was commissioned by the Iraqi government. The Iraqi people love it. It's considered one of the new iconic monuments of Baghdad, up there with all the others.
To claim that the Iraqi people love it, it's just, you know, it's an overrated statement. You cannot claim it without.
I mean, it could depend who you ask, right, Amir?
Well, so I mean, I'm going to be real.
Amir is Iraqi, so his opinion is valid, right? You can't force or impose right or wrong on certain opinions and people. He appreciates it. The people there appreciate it. They feel like it's a revolution, And I think it was very inaccurate to say Iraq is still colonized.
I really appreciate Amir's example. I totally understand it, and when I look at it that way, I agree with it. My problem comes from like the point that Giancarlo's made. In Peshawar, there was a university that was made during the British colonization called Peshawar University. It's a very historical building, and it's like influenced a lot by the British design. And it's beautiful, I don't deny that. But there had been recently an expansion to that university, and they've continued to use the same design in the expansion. In a way, we're still like, there's colonial legacy, we're still colonized, so they're continuing to replicate that.
We have a problem of the lack of gratitude toward ourselves and our culture and our identity. Unfortunately, we believe that imitation is a way of success, and imitation is a way of...
It's not always imitation. I mean, I've grown up in Delhi. Delhi had 7 different invaders come in, and each one came with their own architectural heritage. And each one of those legacies still remain in certain bits. What has to happen is with time, our own style has evolved, and then we need to be able to add it without kind of just extending it by imitation.
There are two main values in proper traditional architecture, classical architecture, and that is respect and humility. Respect for the past, respect for the people that are using it, and for future generations. But what I think is the bigger problem is the modernist architecture, which I argue is not that respectful and does not respect the surrounding environment. And I do see the point about the monumentalist thing. I do think that monumental buildings can be also classical and respectful to the people using it and the environment. But I do not think that that kind of modernist building with no ornamentation or little ornamentation and and a break with the past, I don't think that is made for the people. It's more made for an idea. Or
I largely agree with you, but I wouldn't dismiss it out of hand. Like when we were talking about the Islamic Art Museum, that construction would not have happened if there wasn't a Western imperialist hegemony over the world.
No, but I loved all what you said before, but now this is a turning point for you.
Well, no, what I'm saying is that...
Because architecture has been built based on each civilization passing what they've developed to the other civilization. Yeah. So
well, what I'm saying, it takes influences, right? Different cultural influences, different invaders sometimes, different colonizers, leave their architectural mark on the city, and I don't think that it would be right to just dismiss it out of hand because that's what it came from.
Termed
Just
this
respond
attitude
briefly,
as the colonized complex. So when it's like a Stockholm syndrome when you are infatuated by your prisoner. So
well, no, because I've just been criticizing Western architecture in context when it is harmful, like the example of the suburbs.
The very controversial discussion about the colonial ideas and the colonial brainwashing and the Stockholm syndrome that Ms. Marwa brought up, I was like, oh, like it's getting really heated up here, right? But about the past confusions, I feel like somehow the dots were connecting as the conversation went on.
The only dangerous point, if these buildings are trying to change our identity, the way we live, it start kind of to impose certain kind of, segregation and separation between the communities. That's when architecture becomes problem, dangerous. But if the architecture is serving us and giving us beauty and making a difference, we should celebrate it more than just,
But don't you think we are back to square one with this statement now? I mean, we are back to square one of defining beauty and defining the role of architecture all over again now.
But I'm not talking about the building in terms of beauty. I'm talking even its function.
I mean, there's difference between things that are neat and nice and beautiful. Well, that's what I'm saying when I say that we are back to square one now.
Can I ask you a question?
Of course.
What's the most beautiful building in the world from your point of view?
Well, I don't think it's
we all have a building we like. As an architect, we always have. I can tell you mine. What's your most beautiful? What the building for you that was the most beautiful? That's it. This is the building.
The Umayyad Mosque, if you have to ask this question, although I disagree with the premise, not the most beautiful building in the world, but It's the most beautiful building for me.
For me, yeah.
Wahed, what's your favorite piece of architecture?
It would probably be something from Zaha Hadid. When I was younger, I never knew about Zaha Hadid. I was like, who's this person? I just saw a magazine. It had such a beautiful building. I was like, what is this? And then I read about her profile, and I was like, I want this person to build my house in the future. I was like, I love this design. And growing up, I've always seen so many Zaha Hadid designs where, you know, if it's the Al Wakr Stadium here in Qatar, or if it's the airport in China, all these designs were so beautiful. It's because the idea of building something so futuristic is so amazing to me. Because as humanity, I think we should strive for the best. We should build things that outlast us and that kind of inspire us to do bigger things.
Absolutely hate Zaha Hadid's, like, you know, architecture and their designs. I just fundamentally disagree with how those designs are constructed. It's a very neo-futuristic, like, you know, way of like designing architecture. I disagree with that. I think it belongs nowhere on earth. It's not rooted in any tradition, quite frankly. You can pretend it is, but it's not. It's just ugly. Like you look at it and it looks so out of place on every single society on earth, right? I get it. It comes from this desire to be futuristic, to be modern, but why?
I do love Zaha's designs, absolutely. But I think as much as I'm an advocate for future, I really do believe in the power of traditional and vernacular. And specifically for me, my favorite architect will always be Yasmin Lari. She's a Pakistani, she's the first woman architect in Pakistan. And she's done some amazing work, some of which is the Anguri Bagh in Lahore, which is basically essentially she developed low-income housing society, and it uses the traditional concepts of having those open roofs for their vegetation, and then the idea of communal settings. For me, architecture always speaks the most when it's highly contextualized, and it speaks to the locality, and it really brings into the principles of the vernacular, brings in those concepts of traditionality, and weaves it into this idea of what our tomorrow could potentially look like.
It was really nice to have Huda there because she is a designer. She understands these things on a different level than we do. Of course, a lot of us were talking about them personally or emotionally, you know, or how we feel on a daily basis, but she has experience in that. So I think her opinion brought a lot to the conversation.
We are all talking about these values which is rooted in a singular culture. If I were to take someone like me, who's actually a global nomad, I was born in the Middle East, I've been raised in India, I've lived in UK, I've lived in China, I've worked there. When I start to rethink about what is it that would be culturally relevant to me when I exist in such a multicultural dimension, a lot of these conversations don't resonate. So my question would be, how would you see a world which is going forward much smaller, much tighter, and much more multicultural? So there are different values being brought in, and it's not a singular value or a past that you can refer back to.
But we can see which ones...
Lean, go ahead.
I feel like this is such a nice point. And to me, I believe that this is why architecture should be more regionally exclusive. Now, what do I mean by that? If you were to go to the Middle East, we're more likely to have indoor areas than outdoor areas. Therefore, if you were to come here, regardless of whatever cultural background you come from, you would at least appreciate how useful these buildings can be for you. And if it's functional to the region and functional to the people's day-to-day lives and movements, people from different backgrounds and different cultures would even appreciate it and wouldn't feel as excluded.
Bouncing off of what Lynn has just said, I think what really would make sense is whichever country you're going to go to, you get to experience the culture there, you get to experience how people live there, and also because you want those buildings to fit within that context, because you get to see that, at least with most of the modern architecture that now exists, with regards to the environment, some of the materials that are being used aren't sustainable, aren't strong, and those buildings won't even last for, I would say, like, for the next 50 years.
Okay, Tariq, go ahead.
I think going back, the only identity label, passport, an architecture should carry is what it reflects from its surrounding and environment.
Yes.
That's it. Then this is one thing. The second thing is we also need to understand that architecture is not one-way traffic. As we got some influence from the West, if we call it, we also passed a few things. Do you think the concept of courtyard as social aspect of the house is a Western idea? The concept of the double skin, the mashrabiyya, So architecture is really about engaging and about exchanging ideas, experience.
Carl, what are you going to take away from this conversation with the students? Because we need to be wrapping it up shortly.
The comment that I wanted to address about the enjoyment of enjoying different architectural styles and cultures, because I think that is one of the really large benefits with classical architecture, is that you can have these specific styles and that they are not frozen, that they can develop. Like one brief examples, I visited the Portuguese island of Madeira, and sailors used to live on that island, and they went to Asia, they were inspired, and suddenly the roofs started having this Chinese flip on the top, and that just shows that, well, there is a brief connection with Asia there, and you can do so much variation. But then you have the modernist architecture, which is supposed to be all-encompassing and universal and global, and you feel so estranged. But
Absolutely.
When you visit different architectures that are so different culture, you feel more at home.
Okay, Marwa, what will you be taking away from this conversation?
Well, I think all civilizations, past or current, move along the pendulum between two attitudes, one of love and the other one is of fear. And I think the real risk here is that we are focusing on the idioms that creates this perpetuation of fear through an architecture of domination, of control, of big scale, of basically a complete and comprehensive control over the built environment. Unless we went into the side of love, which is championed through beauty and higher values, then we will keep the conversation, going circular.
Okay, Tariq, and you? What will you take away from this talk with the students?
It's like a summer breeze. It's really refreshing. I mean, I was really impressed by the intellectuality of the young generation. I mean, I'm double your age almost, but in your time, we were a bit more shy. But yeah, I mean, honestly, it's beautiful ideas. So I think architecture is in a safe hand. I don't know how many architects here. Maybe
one.
None.
They said
one. We have one. Huda. Yeah.
He's like, never mind.
Badisha, and for you,
well, I think
what stands out? What will you remember the most from this bunch?
I would extend what Tariq is saying. Yeah. I am very impressed with the level of engagement, and since there's only one architect, so I'm hoping there's some clients and engineers and urban planners and others. So it's a really important discussion. That's what I take away. It is good that we can have this discussion, and it is good that there are extremely opposing points of view, because when we push against each other, hopefully we come to a middle ground, which then is something which is sustainable in terms of growth and our future.
Okay, wonderful. Well, that brings us to the end of this episode of Doha Debates. Thank you to our speakers, our students, and all of you for watching and listening. We've explored bold ideas, challenged assumptions, and open space for understanding with respect and curiosity at the center. But the conversation doesn't end here. Now it's your turn. What do you think? Share your thoughts, your questions, your own perspectives. We're listening.
I think everyone was so passionate because they have their own meaning of architecture, where in some cases, for some people, like architecture reminded them of home, and for others, architecture like reminded them about just the way of living, or like about their past, about the future, about the present. And it was really interesting. Like for me, architecture is all about the future.
It would be more interesting to hear them talk, like a lot of interesting questions were being raised, and the more that they were raised, I was like, never thought of that, why didn't we discuss this? It's so interesting.
I have a bit of a more lenient view on architects now. I went in with the mindset where it's like, okay, architects, they say a lot of stuff, but at the end of the day, they're just working for the dollar. Very much still true, but I am a bit more empathetic to their plight now, where it's like, okay, maybe they actually do want to help, or maybe they actually do want to do things a certain way, but the clients and the way that they think has still not really caught up with the way that they're thinking. So I think I'm a little bit more cognizant of that fact now.